tell me how did you get involved in the Kennedy assassination?
Well, when I first became involved in the Kennedy assassination was when it happened. And Nancy and I went to a graduate student dinner on that Saturday night, and another graduate student, philosophy, a Greek guy, Alex Morlatos, predicted that Oswald would be killed before trial. The next day, Nancy and I drove down to Washington to view the body on a catafalque in the Capitol. And in driving down, of course, we were listening to the radio. Oswald was killed. Uh, we returned to New Haven, to this little apartment we were living in. And on Tuesday, I think, of the next week, Life magazine hit the newsstands with its black and white Zapruder frames. At the same time, there was an article in the New York Times, I think on Monday, um, quoting Dr. Malcolm Perry as to the incision he made for the tracheostomy through a pre-existing bullet hole, which appeared to be an entry hole. It's embarrassing to say this, but this is what I did. With Life magazine in one hot little hand and the New York Times in the other hot little hand, I walked down to the local FBI office and I asked to see an agent to bring this to his attention. And what I brought to his attention that Tuesday was Dr. Malcolm Perry says he got shot in the front of the throat. The Zapruder film shows he's facing away from the depository. Now, I know these intelligence sources, Life magazine and the New York Times, are probably familiar to you in the FBI, but still, I wanted to bring this to your attention. he thanked me. Yes, young man, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and undoubtedly stuffed the whole thing in the wastebasket after that, and didn't write a 302, but it would be very interesting if I could find the 302 he wrote on that. So that was the time. Over the next few months and years, as the Warren Commission 26 volumes came out, I would just enjoy reading various parts of the 26 volumes and comparing that with the conclusions. And again, I then began in 1964 65 to find obscure articles on the Kennedy assassination. There was nothing in the major press. Of course, the Warren Commission was the last word on it, and that was that. But I found these articles in obscure publications like Liberation Magazine or The Minority of One. And they were written by a Philadelphia lawyer by the name of Vincent Salandria. And they were analyses of the evidence and pointed out discrepancies between the conclusions of the Warren Commission and the evidence upon which it was based. They were very good articles, and as a matter of fact, the points that Vincent Salandria made then are correct even now. So then I ended up teaching at Yale and then got a new job as assistant professor at Haverford College. I went down to Haverford College, and in the winter of 1965-66, the Vietnam War had heated up, and I was appalled. Appalled because earlier on I had been an officer in UDT 21, and in July of 1958 had command of a small UDT detachment during the U.S. invasion of Lebanon. And from that experience, which ended up being based upon false intelligence and being a mess, from that experience, I had enormous sympathy for the young men who were sent to Vietnam, and also contempt for the whole thing. So very early, Nancy and I both joined the anti-war movement and led various protests and things in the Philadelphia area. One weekend, another professor and I went to Media, PA, and distributed very, I won't say fiery, we distributed literature put together by the American Friends Service Committee. We went there because the local sheriff of that county had said, any of them peaceniks come into my area, I'm going to bust them. They better not come here. Well, we went there and we distributed this literature, and we were both arrested for littering. So we were taken to the local jail and locked up for a couple hours. And then the ACLU sent out an attorney to get us out. And that attorney had us pulled out of the cells into the squad room where there was Captain so-and-so, Sergeant so-and-so, Lieutenant, all these people gathered around. And he spoke to us in their presence. And he did the most brilliant job of bluffing that I've ever seen in 30 years as a detective. He looks at his watch and he says, now, we've contacted Attorney General Katzenbach in Washington. So when the FBI agents arrive, I imagine in about 15 or 20 minutes, I want you to tell them that not only have your civil rights been violated here, but you are suing for false arrest. Captain so-and-so, Lieutenant so-and-so, Sergeant and Patrolman so-and-so. We were out of there in a minute and a half after he said that. And that man was Vincent Salandria. So I met Vince Salandria under those circumstances. And I mentioned immediately that I'd read his articles on the Kennedy assassination and admired the articles and admired him. We became friends. And that spring and summer, especially in the summer, we began driving to Washington, D.C., to the archives, where some documents from the Warren Commission had already been released. We did that for a series of months. We actually were able to see, one of the few people on the planet to be able to see a very dim copy of the Zapruder film. We were able to take slides of the Zapruder film and put them in two projectors and compare them frame by frame to get the movements of people right. So Vince and I were going to write an extended magazine article. And we started to write. And pretty soon, we disagreed about the interpretation of evidence. What a surprise in this case. And I like to write. There are 4 books over there. I like to write. Vince didn't like to write. So basically, we abandoned the joint project, and I continued to write and put together about a 90-page manuscript. And through friends of friends, I was able to secure an appointment with Willie Morris, who was then the editor of Harper's Magazine. And I went up to New York to see Willie Morris. And when I got there, I called in, and Morris had been called away and could not see me for 5 or 6 hours. So, simply with time to waste, I stopped in to see Don Preston, who was the executive editor of Bernard Geiss Associates, and a friend of a friend, who he had told my friend that he was very interested in what I was doing on the Kennedy assassination, and if I ever got up to New York, come in and see him. So I did. And Don's a great editor. So we chatted about various things, and then Don disappeared and said, we're going out to lunch with Bernie Geiss. Cool. So we went out to lunch with Bernie Geiss, and at the end of lunch, Bernie Geiss said, Don, I want you to draw up a contract for Thompson. He's going to do a book for us on this. What? Well, okay. So I got a $500 advance, but they would pay expenses. I had never been to Dallas. So I immediately thought, great, I can go to Dallas and do some tests that I wanted to do. So I went back to Philadelphia, continued to teach, and purchased an ABNY level. An ABNY level permits you to determine with great exactitude the elevation to a particular spot. You set it up with a level, it's an ABNY level, and then you get the elevation. And I went to Dallas with my ABNY level. And I got out Sunday morning, I got out in the middle of Elm Street and measured the distance to the roofs of various buildings and found the records building was exactly 27 degrees above the point where Connolly got hit. Well, the angle through Connolly was 27 degrees. So I thought, well, I really have something there. But this is all very rudimentary. And through Vince Salandria, I learned of the existence of other folks around the U.S., private individuals, who were interested in the same questions, who were trying to dig into this case, to investigate it, if you would, through the documents that are provided in the 26 volumes and other things. Ray Marcus was one. Sylvia Marr, wonderful Sylvia Marr, was another. And later, Sylvia Marr and I became very close friends. There were a whole bunch of people. So, in talking to Geis and Don Preston, I had mentioned that the film, the copy of the Zapruder film that I had seen in the archives, was a very foggy, sort of bad copy. And that I had heard that Life magazine, who purchased the film, had a really great copies, and I sure would like to see them. Well, they had contacts at Life. So within about 10 days or 2 weeks, I found myself over at Life magazine with Don Preston, and we met with Loudon Wainwright, and I think Ed Kern and Dick Billings. And they screened the Zapruder film for me, and it was eye-blasting. I mean, it was incredibly clear, given what I'd seen at the archives. So they were in a funny situation. Mark Lane's book had come out in the summer of '66. Edward Epstein's book, Inquest, had come out in the summer of '66. There was a kind of interest growing in the Kennedy assassination and the possibility that the Warren Commission had gotten it wrong. There was interest, but there was no real knowledge. They could read these books, but these were secondary works. An editor could read these books, but they were secondary works. And Life magazine could have trained up an editor or several editors in 3 or 4 months to do a good job of investigation on this. But they, I think, trusted me and thought that I could provide now what they could only get by training their own people up in 3 or 4 months. And now it was everything, because in the world of media, the first person there, of course, is important. Well, what did they think I could provide? Well, what I did provide. Basically, the identity of witnesses to talk to, some of whom were never mentioned in the 26 volumes, but names I'd found in the archives, in the documents there. Questions to ask the doctors at Parkland Hospital. Questions to ask the autopsy surgeons. Relevant pieces of evidence which should be photographed really well now, not just given the ordinary archive photographs. Issues to pursue. Where were the bodies buried in this case? And how would you extricate a determination whether this was a body or just a chimera, right? So they decided, I think, that I could be useful to them. Well, they could be useful to me because they could provide access to me to these people who wouldn't give me the time of day. If I called up Dr. Boswell, who I subsequently interviewed, he wouldn't have given me the time of day. If Life magazine calls up, well, of course, right? This was marvelous. And what's more, they had the Zapruder film, and they had the best copies in the world of it, and I could study them. So a deal was brokered, and the deal was pretty simple. I would hire on as a consultant to them. My job was to co-direct the, the assassination investigation with Kern and Billings. It was not just to be their flunky, it was to co-direct the investigation. And that I would do this for an indeterminate period. When they decided that they were not going to do any more stories on this, then that would end. In 6 months after my retention as a consultant on this, I would be free to publish anything I learned. And that was the critical point. I mean, I could not be muzzled by this. Anything I learned, I could publish. So we started. We all flew to Dallas, where we interviewed Dr. Gregory. Dr. Gregory, using these wonderful 4x5 transparencies made from the original film. A very interesting interview with Dr. Gregory. We went to Parkland Hospital, which didn't let anyone in at that point. Parkland Hospital had had it at this point with inquiries about the Kennedy assassination. And there I was able to interview Daryl Tomlinson, who found CE 399, and most importantly, interview O.P. Wright, who was the security director, who had been deputy chief of police of Dallas, who had a very educated eye for bullets. And when I showed him various photographs of bullets, finally, including 399, told me that 399 was not the bullet they found. That the bullet they found had a very pointed tip, and in fact gave me an example of a bullet like the bullet they found. I interviewed Boswell, as I said. I interviewed Bill and Gail Newman for the first time, who had never been interviewed before. I found their names in the papers. I interviewed Marilyn Sitzman, who had never been interviewed before. And most importantly, I interviewed Hudson, the railroad supervisor, who was on the overpass with 5 or 6 of his friends, and had some pretty amazing stuff to tell us. So we did a lot of this, and we began setting up an investigation in Dallas by a private investigator of DeMorenshield. So we started, and at the time, which was November 1966, at the time, we learned there was a New York Times investigative team on the case. We never had direct contact with them. We never really even saw their footprints. In other words, in a case like I do now, you're looking for the footprints of the other side when you go and talk to people. You want to know what the other side is doing. We never saw any footprints from the other side. So we worked on this, and the fruit of that work together was the first break in the kind of media establishment view of the Kennedy assassination. It was a Life magazine issue in November of 1966, which put Zapruder frames on the cover, and with the headline, "Grounds for Reasonable Doubt." Doubt what? Doubt the Warren Commission's view of what happened. Accompanying that article was a long interview of John Connally, in which John Connally, as he had from the very beginning, as he had before the Warren Commission, reiterated the fact that he could not have been hit by the same bullet that hit Kennedy, that he was hit by a later shot. And this problem, which had been there from the beginning, which Vince Salandria had mentioned in his very early articles, became really basis for the rebuttal to the single bullet theory. After that article was published, um, the investigation began to lose steam. In December of '66, I had heard of Garrison's investigation starting in New Orleans. I'd heard it on the grapevine, and I can't tell you who I heard this from now. It may have been Vince, it may have been Sylvia Marr, it was somebody had heard that Garrison was doing this. I told Dick Billings about that, and Dick Billings flew down to New Orleans and signed Garrison up to an exclusive contract for his investigation of the Kennedy assassination. That whatever Garrison did, Life magazine would be in on the ground floor and would be given exclusivity. A couple of Times-Picayune reporters learned that Garrison had sold his story to a national publication and were pissed. They put together enough information from public record sources to put an article in the Times-Picayune that Garrison was investigating the Kennedy assassination. And that blew the top off it. Garrison then reacted like any big city DA and started making arrests and started blowing off to the press. And the whole thing became a total disaster. Sylvia Marr and I said that at the time, that this is, that Garrison is being as unfair to Shaw as the government had been to Oswald earlier, that this was a travesty of justice. Time went on, and slowly by February, March, or April of that year, it was clear that Life magazine was not pursuing this any further. Now, what do I think about the article I worked on? I think it was not nearly as strong as it could have been. I know that because I knew what we had, and much of what we had was not used. Do I think that betrayed some sort of political bias on the part of Life magazine? No. I think it has to do with sociology. That I know that our article, before it could be printed, had to be signed off on, I think, by 14 people. The effect of that sort, and that's how Time Inc. works. That's the way Time magazine works. I think that's the way Newsweek works. But that certainly was the way Life magazine worked. If 14 people have to sign off on a story on the Kennedy assassination, you know it's going to be reduced to the lowest common denominator. And that's what happened. This was not a political bias. It's simply how things worked there. Subsequent to that time, the investigation collapsed. Oh, collapse may be too dramatic a word. I think ran out of steam. And I don't think that was due to any political bias either. This case is inordinately recalcitrant. The evidence in this case is inordinately complex and recalcitrant. And I think when you're dealing with a national publication, and obviously, it was obvious to me when the people I worked with, Kern and Billings, were really good journalists, really good journalists. They would have given their eye teeth to break this story. given their eye teeth. It wasn't because people didn't want to break the story. It was because the evidence was so confusing and recalcitrant that it would take a long, long time. And they didn't have a long, long time. So, my contract, I think, was terminated in March of 67. In June of 67, I knew that I needed to use frames from the Zapruder film to illustrate various points in the book. So we applied to Life to buy the right to publish frames from the Zapruder film. CBS News at the same time applied to Life to use the Zapruder film in their TV shows. We know that that decision was not decided by George Hunt, the editor of Life, but was passed up to actually the board of Time Inc. And the board of Time Inc. made a judgment in June of 67 not to permit the Zapruder film to be used either by me or by CBS News. I don't know what CBS News offered, but I know that Geis and I offered all commercial interest in the book, and we were turned down. We then went to a copyright attorney at Columbia, and he gave us advice as to what to do. I had made copies of the Zapruder film in Time's offices, in Life's offices in New York. I had snuck a camera in and photographed these frames. And I'll tell you why. I was afraid that this film, in the copies that were available to Life, might suffer accident. The reason for that is the following. I mentioned we all flew to Dallas and we interviewed Dr. Gregory with these wonderful 4x5 transparencies. We returned to the hotel and found there Hank Saddam, who was the Miami bureau chief for Life, and was setting up the interviews with Connolly. We went out to dinner. Saddam did not accompany us out to dinner. We left the 4x5 transparencies with him. When we came back from dinner, since I hadn't had a chance to study them yet, and I was salivating to get that chance, I asked if I could take them up to my room and study them that night. And Billings said, sure. I guess some residual thought from the Navy stuck in my mind that if you're going to take custody of something, make sure you know what you're taking custody of. And it's a really good thing I did, because I found that now 4 frames that we had had that afternoon were now missing. We're not in the group. I pointed that out to Kern and Billings and said, there's no way I'm taking these out of the room. Here they are. You can see they're missing. I learned the next day, or the next night as we were flying back from Dallas, that the next morning Kern had gotten Saddam out of his room and Billings had searched his room for the transparencies. Well, I didn't know what was going on, but it sort of smelled to me like some sort of power struggle with Life that I didn't know anything about, but that I was a little worried about the integrity of these things at that point. So I snuck a 35 millimeter camera into the offices of Life magazine. And when Kern and Billings left for the night, I stayed on to study the film, right? Set up the camera in a copying sneak and started snapping away. I got him in there. Still, they're good copies. Kern came back, found me copying the material, and said, what are you doing, Tink? I said, hey, I can't come up to New York every time I want to look at these. I gotta have copies down in Philadelphia. Okay. So that was that. Kern later, the next day, told George Hunt that I had copies, we later learned. In any case, that's the way it went. And in the fall of 1967, the Saturday Evening Post, the Saturday Evening Post purchased the condensation rights to 6 seconds because they were convinced it was worthwhile. Ultimately, they put a cover and backed it with 2 editorials. Um, Here's a funny vignette. Talk about telling stories. Stand by 1 second. Okay. Go ahead. By that time, on the main line of Philadelphia, I was known in the local press as Hanoi Hannah's helper. Right? Curtis Publishing was owned by the Curtis family that lived on the main line. James Atwater was the editor-in-chief of the Saturday Evening Post. I had learned early that the Curtises had complained to Atwater, "What's this? You're running this communist's book in our magazine?" So they were unhappy about me. I was on the phone dictating changes to the galleys to Atwater when Nancy intervened on an emergency basis and said, "Tink, there are a couple of FBI agents here to see you." Unruffled, I said, "Okay, that's fine. I'm talking to Jim Atwater. When I get done, I'll come home and talk to them." And she hung off. Atwater heard all this. I didn't say a thing. I just left it as it was, right? Just left it as it was. And then went home. Here's another funny story. There were 2 FBI agents. They were from Agent Lewis and his buddy from the media FBI office. And they were there to see me because I think I'd burned my Navy Reserve card at a rally at some point or other. And so we skirmished around. I pulled out a tape recorder and started to record them. And they said, "Oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that." And I said, "Well, what's the authority for that?" And the refrain was, "We'd prefer not to say." So I said I had to talk to my lawyer first before. So I called up Vince Landry. He wasn't my lawyer, but I wasn't going to talk to them. It'd be out of your mind to talk to them. But towards the end of it, a light bulb went off in my head. Agent Lewis, Vaganoff, Igor Vaganoff. Early on, Vince Landry and I had been on the trail of a guy from Philadelphia who had driven to Dallas the week before with a rifle. His name was Igor Vaganoff. And when we were in the archives, of course we were interested in this, so we looked up Vaganoff in the index, and we found that this Agent Lewis from the media FBI office, right, had been doing some interviews out here about Vaganoff. Nothing ever came of it, right? But it was part of it. So as they're about to leave, I said, "Agent Lewis, I thought your conclusions in the Vaganoff matter were just wrong." He said, "What? What are you talking about?" I said, "You remember you did some work on a guy named Igor Vaganoff? It was the Kennedy assassination. It was in December. Yeah, I guess so." And I said, "Well, you talked to Mrs. Kolakowski, and she said that Vaganoff was really not at her place on the Tuesday before the assassination. But you also interviewed June Peters, who confirmed that, and yet you confirmed all of that." Huh? I mean, this was blowing his mind. Some peacenik, right, knows of an investigation I carried out on. See, they didn't know I had anything to do with the Kennedy assassination at this point, right? And the clincher, the clincher was. So he said, "But okay, I think you're right. I think I remember all this, but how do you know about this?" I said, "I'd prefer not to say." So that was, that's the way it went. Then Life magazine tried to get the Saturday Evening Post not to publish. Threatened prior restraint. Ha ha ha! You're not. That's not going to happen in this country. And then when the book was published, they sued me and Geis and Random House and everybody in sight. And my contract made me liable to pay for everybody. So I never got a penny out of 6 seconds. I paid for it. And I think Geis lost some money on it too. As a matter of fact, we had good sales. Um, Ultimately, federal court in New York, in the case called Time Inc. versus Geis et al., ruled that our use of artist renderings of the Zapruder film was a fair use. And so he granted summary judgment to us. Time Inc. did not appeal, and that particular court decision expanded the First Amendment with regard to events of great public import.
That's really interesting. I never knew about that case. Um, on a side note,
It's actually cited in extenso in the copyright law books. Well, I think the basic one is by Zimmer.
separate issue. I'll definitely check that out. Okay, so after '67, um, how's your involvement the Kennedy assassination research gone?
Well, I mentioned Garrison, and Garrison was an absolute disaster to the research effort. Um, and Garrison appeared on the scene, I think, in 1968. With Garrison's appearance on the scene, I decided that I did not want my life to go down the toilet on this case. So I was assistant professor at Haverford. In 1969, I got a Guggenheim Fellowship to write a critical biography of Kierkegaard, which sits over there. That's the blue book from Knopf. Went to Denmark for a year and wrote a critical biography of Kierkegaard. Came back to Haverford. Um, got a extra fast promotion to associate professor. Blah blah blah. But kept my ear open to what was going on in the Kennedy assassination. You have good friends. Um, Sylvia Marr was one. Paul Hoke is another. Peter Dale Scott is a third. I kept my eye open and ear open to what was going on. And ultimately, in 1975, Berkeley Books brought out a paperback of 6 seconds. So I wrote a preface to that. But didn't do anything strenuous on that. Summer of 1976, came to California. We rented our house for a year, and on sabbatic leave, I came out here to write a critical biography of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And various things happened, and I ended up getting a job with Hal Lipson, who's probably the dean of American private detectives. And the job was to tail people around the Oakland docks. Here, the kind of liberal, leftist, radical college professor ends up working for management in a labor dispute. The union people had burned down a $4 million warehouse and were shooting out the boxes on the cable TV lines. So there were a bunch of us tails, 4 or 5 tails out, tailing the union members around hoping to catch him shooting out boxes on the, and one thing led to another, and I couldn't turn back. I couldn't go back. And then Lipsett's partner, David Fetchheimer, quit and invited me to join him as an operative, as a trainee, as it were, and I did, and had some pretty wonderful adventures.
So, so once after 67, 68, after the Garrison, that was pretty much it for you?
Well, that was pretty much it. Not quite. Not quite. That was pretty much it until the House Select Committee report came out. And I found in that report, with its center in the acoustics evidence, a real sort of vindication. And with that in mind, I undertook for Peter Dale Scott to write a chapter on their report dealing with Dealey Plaza. Let me tell you what the vindication was. Back in the late 60s, there was a lot of what one would call soft evidence pointing to a particular firing location on the grassy knoll. What was that evidence? Well, Bowers looks from his railroad tower, sees a couple of guys standing behind the fence. Holland, it was not Hudson, it was Holland. S.M. Holland was the railroad supervisor who, with his 4 or 5 other people, noticed smoke come out from under the bushes along that fence line. Holland then went back there and found fresh footprints in the mud, cigarette butts and mud up on the fence at a particular location. In addition, you have the odd movement of Kennedy's head backwards and to the left under impact. You have the dispersion of impact debris to the left rear over the motorcyclist riding to the left rear of the limousine. You have the skull fragment thrown, etc. And most importantly, there is an anomalous shape in the Moorman photograph at a particular point along the stockade fence, about 15 feet up from the corner. All of this evidence seems to converge on that one spot. The Moorman photograph, of course, was taken only 1/9 of a second after the impact on Kennedy's head. So all this soft evidence converged on this one point. The House committee decided to study the one shot which appeared to come from the knoll. And they did that by setting up a one gun that was fired from behind the fence but some distance away from the spot I picked, and another gun from the 6th floor window. Then they scattered mics and recorded. This gave them then control to then use to determine where this third shot on November 22nd was fired from. The experts hired by the committee ultimately picked a location for that firing point. In other words, this was scientific studies established a 3-foot circle of probability for the firing point of that shot from the knoll. The center of that 3-foot circle of probability was what I picked. In other words, that particular location around which all this soft evidence seemed to point. So I found that as quite a vindication. Also, I'd picked 4 shots. The House committee now said that 4 shots had been fired, not 3. So I thought this was considerable vindication. I was delighted with it. So I worked with Peter Dale Scott on this particular book, and it never came to be for various reasons. So once again, there was kind of a hiatus in the early 80s. And then in the 1990s, there was renewed interest due to Oliver Stone's film. And I was invited to go to various conferences and speak, and I was delighted to do that. And then in the late 90s, a, uh, a, new, a new theory began to be adumbrated. And that theory was just nuts. That theory claimed that the Zapruder film had been altered, presumably by various shadowy intelligence agencies, and that hence the evidence that we'd look to as the kind of foundational evidence in the case had in fact been altered, faked up, constructed by the federal government. One of the chief proponents of that particular view was a sort of pedestrian academic by the name of James Fetzer, who taught at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. He was a philosophy professor of all things. And so in 1998, I went to a Lancer conference and took on Fetzer directly. And this was 1998. I think there's probably a videotape of that. I remember the end of that was Fetzer was talking into a microphone and ranting into a microphone, and the sponsor of the conference turned off the power to the microphone. He was left talking into a dead mic. I remember that. In any case, I came back into this area simply because I was offended by how silly many of these arguments had become. And so I've written various demolitions of that particular theory. And along with Gary Aguilar, we've done some new research on Commission Exhibit 399 and issues of that sort. There is a really serious issue hiding underneath all this. So it's not just a conflict of personalities. There has to be a real question now as to the integrity of the evidence in the Kennedy assassination. I say that because it's no longer problematic that the photos and x-rays in the National Archives have evidentiary problems with them. For example, they are all supposed to be original x-rays. Well, David Manning has shown without any question that at least one of those x-rays is a copy. Why? Because the x-ray shows that part of the surface of the photograph is peeled back. Now, that can't be an original. It has to be a photograph of an x-ray. It has to be a copy of an x-ray. We also know that the camera that was supposed to have taken the photographs at Bethesda with the present lens available for that camera at Bethesda did not take the autopsy photos that we have. That's a real problem. In addition, Gary and I know that there are profound problems with the provenance of Commission Exhibit 399. O.P. Wright told me in 1967 that that was not the bullet that he had in his pocket. It was a pointed bullet. He had an educated eye for bullets as a policeman. I believe him. In addition, an elevator supervisor by the name of Poole reported being at Parkland at the time the bullet was discovered. In the notes of Poole's first report of this, he speaks of a pointed bullet, which would seem to confirm that. In addition, Gary and I have been able to show that the attempt to establish a chain of evidence with regard to 399 failed. We learned that the FBI agents interviewed Tomlinson and Wright, who were the non-governmental people who had the bullet in their possession. They were not able to identify 399 as the bullet that they found. Another FBI agent interviewed Secret Service Agent Johnson and Chief Rowley of the Secret Service, who next had the bullet in their possession. They were not able to identify it as the bullet that they had in their possession. Then we found a memo, an unsigned memo out of Washington, which stated that FBI agent Bardwell D. Odom had interviewed Wright and Tomlinson, and they said they couldn't identify the bullet as 399, but it was generally similar to the bullet, to 399. Unsigned memo. There are no FBI 302s which back that up, which is kind of nuts because everything an FBI agent does. So I found Bardwell D. Odom. Gary called him up, and we went to see him. That bullet found in the hospital? I never had that. What you mean? They're saying that I interviewed you, Tomlinson and Wright? No, I never had that bullet. The final clincher on this. In this transmission of various bullets, of this bullet, right, nobody puts their initials on it. Agent Johnson did. He had it in his pocket all the way to Washington. O.P. Wright didn't, of course. He's just at the hospital. Chief Rowley didn't. But Elmer Todd, the FBI agent who interviewed Rowley and Johnson, testified that before he turned it over to Agent Frazier at the FBI lab, he put his initials on the bullet. His initials are not on the bullet that we have. So, the point is, there are profound problems in various areas. If you drill down in a particular area of the Kennedy assassination, you will often find evidence problems in terms of a chain of custody or in terms of verifying that the evidence really is what it is. That's a real problem. Well, how do you solve that? Well, there's really a simple solution. And you would know it as a photographer and documentary maker. Let's say you have a bunch of photographers shooting the same event, say a horse race, and you want to know who won. Okay. Now let's say it's a horse race and it's become controversial, and somebody claims, right, that one or more of these films or photos has been fiddled, right? You think you can figure out which one has been fiddled? I think you can, because it'll stand out like a sore thumb. All of those films and photos of the same event have to be identical except for their perspective. And if they're not identical, if there are discrepancies between them, they will show. What that means is that the bedrock level of evidence in the Kennedy assassination consists of the films and photographs taken in Dealey Plaza. Now, those photos, most of them only got into government possession very late. That is, after they'd been shown on television, to wit the Nix film, or after they'd been in Life magazine vaults for some time, etc., etc. So it's very difficult to understand practically how any of these things could have been fiddled. But the critical test is that they're self-authenticating, that there's a fabric of self-authenticating evidence. It's the films and photos in Dealey Plaza. Now, Professor Fetzer and his friends have been trying for over a decade to find discrepancies between them. And they come up with the silliest discrepancies you can imagine. But they're all shot down. So that their intense effort to prove a discrepancy has now failed. It's been done. In other words, not only is there a self-authenticating fabric of evidence, but that that self-authenticating fabric has been challenged over and over and over again and found to hold up. So, for my money, this dispute over the authenticity of the Zapruder film has produced real value, strangely enough. Just the opposite of what Fetzer and Company thought they were going to produce. But it's been very valuable that they tried and failed. And so I believe now that that should be taken as your foundational level. What that means is that eyewitness testimony, which is known to be inordinately unreliable. Elizabeth Loftus is the expert on this, and her book is just an indictment of the validity of eyewitness testimony, of how it's subject to manipulation and change, how there are various factors that degrade the reliability of eyewitness testimony. All of those factors were available in Dealey Plaza that afternoon. So now one has a level of a foundational level or bedrock level, if you will, that you can use to evaluate eyewitness testimony and also physical evidence. And so in the future, when genuine historians and genuine forensic experts begin to work on this case, as they will, I think that will be the logic. In other words, one has to first identify a level of evidence which clearly is evidence. And I think you do that, films and photos of Dealey Plaza. Then, by comparing eyewitness testimony and physical evidence with that, you now have the filter you can use to determine the integrity of eyewitness testimony and physical evidence. And slowly, using that logic, I think that you will be able to build up an answer to the question, what happened? Because right now, I don't know what happened.